Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Summer Hot Topics series. I'm Melissa Scanlon. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center. And as our regulars know, you can get CLE credit for this. Just sign your name on the back. For those of you who haven't been here before, this is a lecture followed by a question and answer period. So if questions come up while you're listening to it, just jot them down and wait until the end, and our speaker will take questions. So today I'm really pleased to introduce Jack Cushman. He is one of our media fellows selected from a very competitive pool of over 40 applicants for our summer fellowship for environmental journalists. And he is currently the managing editor and a reporter for the Pulitzer Prize winning Inside Climate News. He's written extensively about energy and the environment, as well as industry, military, finance, and transportation. Previously, before working for Inside Climate News, he spent about 35 years as a writer and editor in Washington, D.C., including with the D.C. Bureau of the New York Times. So he knows where the bodies are buried. He's the author of Keystone and Beyond, Tar Sands and the National Interest in the Era of Climate Change. And today he's going to be presenting the Exxon papers, legal and journalistic implications. So please join me in welcoming Jack Cushman.
Thank you all. I'm really delighted to be here at Vermont Law School. I'm a great fan of the institution, and I have been in loose contact over the years, and intend to continue that. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal expert, but I spent my life in policy, and much of it involved in environmental policy. I'd like to start with a quick video about our project that we did last year, which generated the hashtag ExxonKnew, and which continues to get a lot of attention, including from state attorneys general. And last night on the floor of the Senate, there was a colloquy that I think will continue today that's based largely on this work. So how do I do this? IP? Thank you.
Proponents of the global warming theory say that higher levels of greenhouse gases are causing world temperatures to rise, and that burning fossil fuels is the reason. The scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
We found a trail of documents that go back to 1977. Exxon knew carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, that combustion of fossil fuels were driving it, and that this posed a threat to Exxon. At that time, Exxon understood very quickly that governments would probably take action to reduce fossil fuel consumption. They're smart people, great scientists, and they saw the writing on the wall.
We were collecting data, the Southern Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Western Indian Ocean. Basically every hour we would get several measurements. So we had, I called it a data monster. We were committed, we were doing some serious science. It was a significant budget. I would say on a scale of $1 million a year. And that was a lot of money in 1979. We were generating what we thought was state-of-the-art information. We were doing science that we didn't think in any way, shape, or form would be questioned. And there was no questioning that the atmospheric carbon dioxide was increasing, that atmospheric carbon dioxide was going to change the climate in some fashion. The question was how fast, how much, and what kind of impacts would it have, overall to the planet.
I think all of this is surprising, given what Exxon started to do in the 90s.
Many scientists agree there's ample time to better understand climate systems and consider policy options. So there's simply no reason to take drastic action now.
They claimed that there wasn't enough science to back any kind of decision to reduce carbon emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, when in fact, by the time they started staking out that position, they'd known the science for probably about 15 years, if not longer. They ended up instead leading the denial and clouding of public perceptions of science. I mean, the change is amazing, and that story is what's not known.
So that was Neela Banerjee, one of my colleagues and the leading reporter on the story. My role was more as an editor than reporter on this story, but we're a small operation and we do everything
Are we ready for your time?
collaboratively, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What I'm going to attempt to do here is
Can you
just,
turn the volume up?
how's that in the back? Okay. So I'm going to attempt to walk you through quickly a few of the documents. All of the documents that we based our work on have been published at insideclimatenews.org, and many of them are quite extensive documents, and we of course reviewed other documents during our work which we have not published, and our work is also continuing. But I'd like to talk a little bit about why today we were so interested in what happened in the 1970s and early 1980s. When I was a student, I was taught about Richard Neustadt's book, Thinking in Time, which is about the role of history in public policy decision-making. And his lesson was very simple, and I've continued to follow it. First, you have to figure out what the story is that you're going to tell as you face a decision today. What's the story behind the decision? You need to make a timeline and take yourself back to the beginning of the problem if you're going to understand how you got to the place where you need to make a decision today. And he said you have to ask journalistic questions. And so that's what we set out to do with this project. And we were surprised, really, by what we found. Now, remember, we're going back to 1976. And Roger Revelle was one of the leading climate scientists of our era. And already he was saying, I'm almost certain we're modifying the climate by adding carbon dioxide. This was a man who ran the International Geophysical Year in 1958 and published one of the leading science papers of the 50s showing that the oceans were limited in their absorption capacity. And he said the real question is, what's going to happen? We'll return to Roger Revelle in a moment because in 1977, he was the chairman of a National Academy of Sciences report. And that report said that climate change may be the primary limiting factor on energy production from fossil fuels over the next few centuries. Exxon was listening. Henry Shaw, an Exxon scientist, was at a meeting in Atlanta where that presentation was made, and he reported it back in one of the earliest memos that we have in our Exxon files. We checked in that National Academy of Sciences report and found also that it said that if decisions were postponed until the impact of climate changes has been felt, in other words, until the observations could be shown to exceed natural variability, then by that time, for all practical purposes, the die would have already been cast. And that's a very important concept and understanding when you're facing something uncertain and examining the uncertainties, at what point do you need to act? And it's at the crux of Exxon's performance in this case. That same year, 1977, James Black, a leading Exxon scientist, briefed managers, and he they were so interested in what he said that they said, we want you to spread this around the corporation a little bit more. He gave his presentation to a broader group, and he dictated a 10 or 12 page report articulating what he had told to the board or to the management committee. In that presentation, he only had view graphs. And that was a complicated report. It was full of the uncertainties. So we went to the part where it said summary, and we found this sentence. Under the word summary, in the first place, there's general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. And so he was telling his top management that there was a consensus in 1977 about this problem. He said, given the uncertainties, we probably have 5 to 10 years to better understand things before we have to start making some decisions. Exxon right away set out on a very ambitious research proposal that was unparalleled in the industry at the time. We're going to hear a little bit more about it, but you saw the video of the ocean-going tanker. They were spending, millions of dollars on this project. It was not an inconsiderable investment. And again, we have Shaw. This was a piece of boilerplate that showed up in numerous memos justifying the research program. And the key thing to hear is that they needed to be able to carry bad news, if any, to the corporation. This has legal implications at a time when we're asking ourselves in hindsight whether there should have been disclosure. And when we examine Exxon's subsequent statements over the intervening years, because it's those disclosures that appear to be at the heart of some of the Attorney General's inquiries into Exxon that are now underway. Now, Exxon, they were very proud of what they were doing. They described in this memo a grandiose research plan. They really thought Exxon should be in charge of all research into climate change because nobody else was up to the job. And they said, what would be more appropriate than for the world's leading energy company and leading oil company to take the lead in trying to define whether a long-term CO2 problem really exists, and if so, what countermeasures would be appropriate. They saw this as benefiting mankind. And their PR proposals really took that. I don't know if you can read this, but they had one project where they wanted to sample 100 old bottles of French wine and do some testing to see if they could track the origins of the hydrocarbons in a way that would show how much additional hydrocarbon was due to man-made activities. They thought that was innovative. They thought it was significant to the scientific community. And they said it's significant to Exxon since future public decisions aimed at controlling the buildup of atmospheric CO2 could impose limits on fossil fuel combustion. And so they clearly recognized that this was an existential question for their company, and indeed for all humanity. They also did a lot of modeling work. They brought in modelers from academia and in partnership did some very significant work that essentially confirmed what's called the Charney equilibrium. This is the estimate of how much the planet will warm under any doubling of CO2 concentrations. And to this day, the Charney equilibrium stands at about 3 degrees of warming, plus or minus 1.5 degrees for any doubling of atmospheric CO2. In this particular document, they talked about how this was a clear scientific consensus. And they said that there was unanimous agreement in the scientific community about what its implications were, its ecological implications. We saw in these documents a lot of debate and discussion internally about the uncertainties, and they embraced the uncertainties. I sometimes say they embraced the uncertainties, then they fell in love with the uncertainties, And then they married the Uncertainties, and they lived happily ever after. But in this particular document, one of the scientists was saying, yeah, but by the time this warming signal emerges from the noise, it's going to be the 2020s, it's going to be the 2030s, and it's not going to be catastrophic. And a scientist named Cohen wrote back and said, well, I think that may be too reassuring. I agree, in 2030, it's likely to be well short of catastrophic, but it's distinctly possible that this will produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic for at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population, because by 2030, you'll be in the transient. And in effect, he's mirroring what the National Academy of Sciences was saying. The die will have already been cast by the time you have unmistakable signals emerging in the observed record, which now only in 2016, we've really already come to that point. I don't know, catastrophic, what do you really mean? They quoted a report from the National Academy of Sciences in terms of the societal and institutional response to an increase in CO2. It was felt that, well, not as bad as nuclear war or worldwide famine. By 1984, this was really starting to affect their business decisions. And one part of our series, I'm sure a few of you have read this series. It's about 30,000 words. There are 6 main parts to it. If you'd like to read it on your Kindle, it's an Amazon Kindle single. It's very affordable, and of course, the whole thing is on our website. The Natuna question was one of those 6 pieces. And in this discussion of Natuna, we demonstrate that for years, even decades, at the top level of management, the company was very concerned about the CO2 emissions from the natural gas field, because if it were developed, and they had the rights to develop it, it would be many billions of dollars of investment, and it would be the world's largest single point source of carbon dioxide. And they came to the point in these documents where they said, we simply cannot develop this if it's going to be that big a source of uncontrolled CO2 emissions. And they spent a lot of technical expertise trying to figure out how they might possibly fix this problem and be able to develop a gas field. They never could, and they never did, because they could recognize that this would in effect be a stranded asset in a world of carbon dioxide emission constraints. This is just one of the many documents that we saw about Natuna, and I'll return to the question of Natuna's significance. Why do we care? Because 20 years after 1976, 1978, here we have an article by myself, I'm proud to say, on the front page of the Sunday New York Times in April of 1998, showing how the American Petroleum Institute and Exxon's lobbyists were assembling a science task force whose mission was to introduce uncertainty more effectively into the debate over what was then the new Kyoto Protocol. And in the lobbying memos that provided the basis for that news article, they said that victory would be achieved when, among other things, those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant science appear to be out of touch with reality. This was the uncertainty agenda that provides the context in which we now go back and look at what Exxon and the oil industry had been doing for the previous 20 years. By this time, they were running the ads that, if you recall, used to appear on the op-ed page of the New York Times under Exxon Mobil, first Mobil and then Exxon Mobil. And when facts don't square with the theory, throw out the facts, was their complaint. These ads continued right up until the 2000 election. I'm going to briefly discuss how a legal expert might have interpreted the level of uncertainty and the requirements for disclosure that Exxon confronted. These quotes come from testimony that was given by, I believe his name was Jeffrey Smith, who was the chair of the American Bar Association panel on risk disclosure, testifying at a Senate hearing of the Senate Finance Committee on climate disclosure and the need to increase it. And this was as of 2007. And he said 5 years ago, the reading of the law might have justified silence on climate change for some companies and for several reasons. And then he said the scientific view, that is at the turn of the century, while rapidly coalescing was far from certain and was being publicly dismissed as speculative. So he's saying the fact that science is being dismissed publicly as speculative provided at that time an umbrella under which Exxon would not be required to disclose the risks such as those that affected its decisions on the tuna. He said the Kyoto Protocol hadn't been ratified, et cetera, and he said now maybe things are different as of 2007. I was very curious to see his reasoning, because we know that the reason that the scientific view was being publicly dismissed as speculative was precisely because Exxon and its peers had been injecting the uncertainty into the scientific debate, into the policy debate. And so there was a footnote to that word speculative, and I read the footnote and found it was a New York Times article. It was written by Jim Glantz. And here's what Jim Glantz actually wrote in 2001. Many scientists in the United States have concluded that the current administration is uninterested in scientific research or its conclusions, that major scientists are unwilling to accept White House policies. It was a discussion of missile defense and climate change, and he said there was a substantial consensus against the White House policy, quoting Hugh Gusterson, an academic in this area. Indeed, Glantz said, some experts believe that science's influence in public policy matters has not been at such a low ebb since before World War I. So what I found was the article from 2001 that described the uncertainty was not an article asserting that there was uncertainty about climate science. It was an article asserting that the Bush-Cheney administration had fallen victim to a manufactured uncertainty. And in my reading, that cannot provide an excuse for Exxon to not disclose the risks that it was facing. Now, the reason we know that the Bush administration's attitude was influenced by Exxon is that we have documents here, a lobbying document sent to the White House Council on Environmental Quality in 2001 by an Exxon lobbyist. And they are making recommendations to improve the climate change research program by increasing the work on uncertainty in that program. This was a constant refrain for them. In similar documents from Exxon to the White House, they were more specific. They wanted to restructure the staffing of the science effort. They wanted to replace people like Mike McCracken with people like John Christie and Richard Lindzen, two noted scientists who are outside the mainstream consensus on climate change. They succeeded in having the Bush administration replace those people, and they installed in the White House oil lobbyists who proceeded to rewrite the science from within the administration to make it more palatable to the fossil fuel industry's perspective. And when they were found through a whistleblower named Rick Glantz to have done that, the lobbyists had to leave the White House and he went to work for Exxon. Mike McCracken saw all this happening, and he said that Exxon's opposition to the key scientific findings on this subject was appalling for such an established and scientific organization. This is his letter to the board of Exxon, in which he dissects Exxon's uncertainty campaign from the perspective of the lead scientists of the U.S. Climate Change Research Program. There's been work done on climate change disclosures in the period. Researchers at Colorado ran computer analysis of all the 10K filings of 500, S&P 500 corporations. And they singled out for attention Exxon's 2007 10K, calling it one of the most cursory and insubstantial discussions concerning climate change risks. The discussion consisted of the words, "and the risks of global climate change." That passage marks the whole of Exxon's discussion of climate change related risks for that year. And since this is 2007, this is at the time when Smith was telling the Senate that the days had long since passed that, in Smith's view, it might have been permissible to get away with this lack of disclosure. Naomi Oreskes and colleagues have written in a peer-reviewed article about corporate accountability, a comment that pertains to Exxon, that as a major corporation with a high level of internal scientific and technical expertise, Exxon was aware of and in a position to understand the available scientific data. We know that they were, because we've been inside the heads of the scientists who were debating these questions among themselves. Remember that when it comes to disclosure, it's not a matter of disclosing certainties. It's a matter of disclosing risks. And we're still at a point where we have to consider risks from climate change. There aren't any certainties in this thing, but you can't hide beneath uncertainty as an excuse to do nothing, especially when your business is the leading source of carbon emissions in the world. In the years from 1988 forward, Exxon's carbon footprint has been estimated at more than 18 gigatons. That's about the same as 3 years of all US emissions of carbon dioxide. And Exxon must realize that there are risks both to us and to them from a business as usual model. Why do these documents matter? Well, legal action is now ensued. It's contested, it's highly controversial. This is the beginning of the section on documents to be proposed and to be produced from the Massachusetts Attorney General's subpoena to Exxon, which was issued back in March and recently published. And I note two things that are in this first couple of paragraphs of the documents that they're looking for. One of them is anything having to do with measuring CO2, including without limitations through work conducted on Exxon's SO Atlantic tanker. One of them is about development of offshore gas from the Natuna Island. One of them is about anything that went into the papers prepared and presentations given by James Black on the greenhouse effect in 1978. So those are just three of the disclosures that we made in our series that have now shown up in this subpoena. This is, of course, just paragraph one. I think there are 38 paragraphs that follow, but a lot of them have to do with our documents. And as a work of accountability journalism, it's not up to us to accuse a company of an illegal act, which our stories did not do. But it is our job to illuminate behavior that was in danger of being forgotten in the files and folders of people who worked at Exxon back when my journalism career was just beginning. So I'm happy to show you this. I hope that you'll take the time to read this full report. It's an investment of time, but I think you'll find the history lesson worthwhile. And I'd like to take your questions. Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm interested in hearing more about the lawsuit and how did you get the documents?
We have a stock answer to the question about how we got the documents, which I'm afraid is that we did it the old-fashioned way. Shoe leather, hard work, both looking in archives, looking in published records, and finding people who were participants in the time and saying how much they were willing to tell us. About the lawsuits. While our series was in publication, before we published the final episode, I believe, around November, Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General of New York, disclosed that he had sent Exxon a subpoena inquiring into the possibility of violations of the Martin Act, which is New York's securities law, and its consumer protection statutes. And New York has the most enabling statutes of the kind, but since then several other attorneys general at the states have said that they too are investigating, and several of them have issued subpoenas. Exxon has contested some of the subpoenas in court as overreaching. That's still playing out. The Virgin Islands has withdrawn its subpoena after Exxon objected to its scope and to other aspects of the Virgin Islands work. There's, I believe, there may be a DC subpoena, Massachusetts subpoena. Kamala Harris in California has said that she has an investigation, but we don't know whether there have been subpoenas. We believe that Exxon has responded to the New York subpoena with production of tens of thousands of pages of documents, but of course we don't know what those contain. There have been calls, including by all three of the Democratic presidential candidates, for a federal RICO investigation. This has been supported by liberal Democrats in Congress, notably Sheldon Whitehouse, and they've elaborated on what they see as the justification for a RICO investigation. My observation is that many of the people who are making these demands and the people who favor those investigations and have been active in calling for it and in building a legal case for it, including numerous advocacy organizations, the Union of Concerned Scientists, among others, feel that there are strong parallels to the tobacco investigations, and that the production of documents that would result from this, because bear in mind, Inside Climate News with its staff of, a dozen, and without any legal authorities, was able only to scratch the surface of the history, and nor do we have much new information about the more recent years. So that people who advocate these investigations, I think, expect that they would contain really significant disclosures that would constrain the fossil fuel companies in their attempts, to the extent that they still continue, to obscure the science of climate change. The same day that Schneiderman announced that he was subpoenaing Exxon, he said that he was completing work with Peabody Coal. And in the Peabody case, they reached a settlement. And the settlement lays out in detail what kind of claims about science, about economics, about market forecasts Peabody can make in its public documents without jeopardizing itself in terms of fair disclosure to shareholders. Now, Peabody's in bankruptcy now. Their science discussion of climate change, I would have to say, was bankrupt a long time ago. They typically make arguments in legal filings and in comments on regulatory matters to the effect that carbon dioxide is, of course, a benign gas. We all exhale it, and that there's no evidence that it poses any serious risk to the planet, and indeed, it may be beneficial in some regards, and certainly energy produced by coal is beneficial to all concerned. And they use the data from the International Energy Agency in a way that Schneiderman found inappropriate, and they've agreed to stop doing it in that way. So regardless of whether there's culpability found, there's some prospect that this kind of inquiry into a fossil fuel company can constrain its communications. And that may also be not insignificant as we, because we're now moving to a world where we clearly are going to need to get to zero emissions of fossil fuels. And the science is unambiguous. Even the oil companies, at least oil companies like Shell, will agree that if you name the temperature that you're willing to tolerate as the marker of global warming, then we can name the time when you have to get to zero carbon dioxide emissions. And going to zero carbon dioxide emissions can only be bad news to the corporation when the corporation's entire business is based on combustion of fossil fuels. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Jack, so Exxon's story, of course, is they didn't hide anything. That everything they've done has been published in peer-reviewed literature. They had a hand in developing climate science. They had a very, very significant role in developing climate science. It's all out there for the public to see. It's all in peer-reviewed journals. Didn't hide anything, number one. Number two, material risk, well, maybe to the planet, but certainly not to the shareholders, making out like bandits. So no damage to shareholders. I mean, if they stopped developing the tuna or anything else, they'd be sued under stock shareholder derivative suits. They'd be thrown out of their jobs, bankrupt the company. What's your response?
Well, I've heard this argument, of course. If you read our stories and look at the way that we described Exxon's early climate research, we used words like ambitious, far-sighted. We described how it was a major contribution to the science. We cited the peer-reviewed documents. We spoke to the authors of those modeling documents. And we found that it was really remarkable how in the early days, Exxon, we said, was at the cutting edge of climate science. So it's hard for me to understand why they would consider that to be a false narrative. You can't both say we were at the cutting edge. What would be better than for Exxon to lead this struggle, to spend the money on it, and at the same time to say we came away with no understanding of the risks. So we did not assert that they had covered up the documents. We described how in some of these memoranda, and of course, our work is not just based on peer-reviewed published literature, but on internal corporate memoranda not released by the company and marked with the words not for distribution outside the company, which we obtained and disclosed. So it's not the case that all of these documents were readily available. Certainly, I've not found where they might be available. To the extent that Exxon says we even are putting them on our webpage, this is true because they've made facsimiles of the documents that we put on our webpage and mounted them on their webpage. It's plain because the rusted paperclip marks are in the identical spots on the page. So It's like when Exxon says that Inside Climate News is an advocacy organization. Now, we are funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and we have a board member who is with the Rockefeller Brothers. But our board doesn't set our editorial policy, and the Rockefeller Brothers don't direct, and we're not aware of the work that we were about to publish. However, we're not an advocacy organization, we're a news organization. And believe me, I know the difference. An advocacy organization hires lobbyists, buys advertising, influences policy, not in a transparent exchange of ideas, but in an insider's game. And so I don't worry too much about that accusation coming from Exxon. Now, as to their obligations, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not expert, and we did not assert in our articles that Exxon had violated any securities statute or that they should have done differently. We did observe that nowhere in the 10 years or so of documents involving the tuna did we see any discussion of the risks of that project, which was a very significant project, which the company has not completed, has not pursued. But we never have seen a discussion of that until this summer, when last summer, when documents started to emerge about it. And so we did point out that this internal debate was not reflected in certainly the securities filings of the time or in any other forum that I've been able to locate. And that's just one example. You know, the LA Times independently had a project with the Columbia Journalism School. We found out about it as our work progressed because we'd knock on somebody's door and he'd say, "Are you from the Columbia Journalism School?" And we'd say, "No, but why do people keep asking us that?" And because they were doing a similar project under the direction of Steve Cole, the dean of the graduate school. And they came to precisely the same conclusions that we did about Exxon's early understanding of climate science, based on a different set of documents that they turned up. And some of their documents showed, for example, how Exxon was preparing for the effects of sea level rise and climate change on their investments in Arctic drilling, because they could foresee that the anticipated effects of climate change would be material to their exploration activities. And they put a lot of work into that, while at the same time running advertisements in the New York Times that said, "This is also uncertain. How could anybody ever make any decisions based on it?" Exxon lives in a world of uncertainty. They face risks, they face political risks, they face risks of insurrection, they face risks of the oil not being where they thought the oil was going to be. They face risks of financial risks of Brexit. They face all kinds of risks, and they're used to dealing with it. As it turns out, there's a science of how to react to risk, and it's been brought to bear on climate science. So that if you're uncertain about the extent to which the observed temperature increase is going to match what the models are projecting, it actually increases the return on your investment for taking action now. If you were certain that you were going to die from cancer in 2 weeks, it would change your perspective on what you would eat, but not much. If you thought that there was maybe an extra 1% chance that you would die of cancer at some time in the future from eating whatever that product was, it's more likely to change your diet. So uncertainty can be a reason for action. And Exxon knows this perfectly well. Just as they're used to dealing with modeling uncertainty, because how they find oil on the bottom of the ocean is largely a matter of modeling. Other questions? Yes.
So looking back over your long career, I'm wondering how you assess the performance of the New York Times and the Washington Post and other major media outlets covering the climate issue over the last 30 years?
I think that speaking for the New York Times, I think they've done really a very fine job, although it's had its ups and downs. Its ups and downs are institutional. How much attention does that newspaper pay to this issue has varied, waxed and waned over the years, and as a priority. But I do think that our coverage as to what we wrote was on the ball, early, consistent, going back to Phil Shabikoff covering Jim Hansen in 1988. I mean, I remember Hansen's testimony and Shabikoff's writing about it. The editorial board has been fairly consistent. The mainstream media's coverage sometimes suffers from a he said, she said approach. I think news organizations have gotten better about that as time goes by. It used to be even that you would see a little bit of that when the issue at stake was, for example, evolution. And you're reporting on questions of what should be in science textbooks, there would be a little bit of, on the other hand, so-and-so thinks such and such, and it gives a legitimacy to discredited views. But I think that that's less apparent these days. I do think that the mainstream press sometimes is trapped in a business as usual mindset and has a jaded tendency to think that we're not able to change. You know, so does the Energy Information Administration. You know, they have a tendency to forecast solar capacity by laying a ruler on what the old solar capacity trend was and just taking it out another 30 years. And I think Exxon in its business forecast, its annual business forecast, and in its pieces on climate risk that under shareholder pressure it has now started to produce, also constrains its field of vision as it examines these in a way that lends it to a business as usual approach. Whereas other corporations have tended to be more broad-minded. And I think myself that we will continue to surprise ourselves with our ability to change gears and do things in a different way, just as you as lawyers can sometimes surprise yourself in your ability to change the law. You know, in some of these areas of law, such as bringing tort actions against corporations for having inflicted damage on a population of, say, Alaskans who have to move, may not be able to get a satisfactory outcome from the tort law of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Tort law too changes. And you as lawyers can change the law as much as guys down at MIT can change solar panels. And when they do that, we benefit from getting cheaper, cleaner energy. And when you do that, we benefit from getting more effective public policy and greater ambition in a time when what's needed in combating climate change, if anything, is higher ambition. We're not nearly ambitious enough. And whether it's journalists, lawyers, computer geeks, everybody has to get a little more ambitious here.
Well, that's a great spot to end. So thank you for being here.
I'll be here for 2 weeks. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to talking to as many of you as I can, and I urge you to finally get around to reading that huge piece on Exxon. Thank you so much.